Hello and welcome to our PowerPoint module for this week. We're going to be talking about health behaviors. Now, we've already discussed health behaviors in class during most of the sections that we've covered already, but here we're going to focus more explicitly on health behaviors and also theory related to health behavior in public health. Okay, so that's where we're focused this week. Again, this is going to apply to a lot of what we have already done. The objectives for this week are first to introduce and examine several common theories within the health behavior literature. And then we're going to focus on one in particular, and that is the health belief model. We're going to apply this to several examples, and then consider the strengths and limitations of common health behavior theories and health behavior theories overall, okay? So we're not going to go through every single one, obviously. Health behaviors, this is a large field. Health behaviors is a field within public health and also studied within sociology and other social sciences. We're only spending 1 week on this, but I do hope to at least give you a brief survey of the field. Here are your deliverables for this week. As usual, you have your reading question due Monday night, your PowerPoint module due Tuesday night, and then you technically have your course paper rough draft due this Friday, the 9th. However, as I discussed in class last week, you really have until next Thursday, the 15th, to submit it on Inquire and to have it completed. Okay, so just like we did for the annotated bibliographies, we're softening up this deadline. So as long as you have it on Inquire by Thursday, April 15th at 11:59 p.m., you will get full credit for turning it in on time. Let's get started with our topic for this week. Your opening question for this week is also a video question. I'm asking that you watch a short video clip from Parks and Rec, actually. So it's a fictional clip, but related to health behaviors nonetheless. So watch that video clip from Parks and Rec, the link is on Inquire, and then answer this question. How does this example, so the one you're going to see in the video clip, relate to the relationship between government, industry, and individual behaviors or choice that Galia discusses in the book chapter? Okay, so you can pause here, watch that video clip, answer this question, and then come back to the module. This week, we're going to be talking about health behavior theory. Before we get into theories that are specific to health behaviors, I want to take a step back and talk about what a theory is. If you are in sociology, you are probably familiar with theory and theories, and we've been exposed to theories through all of our education. Typically, at least when I thought of a theory in grade school, I thought of things like gravity and relativity. But here we're talking about theories within the social science realm. What is a theory? So briefly described, a theory is a systematic way of understanding phenomena. And this can be, phenomenon can be a behavior, it could be an event, it could be a situation. So it's pretty broad here. We're talking about the definition of a theory more broadly. And the purpose of theory is to explain patterns that we observe. And in the case of social or public health theory, we're trying to explain social phenomena, so social patterns or health-related patterns. Theories also seek to specify relationships between variables. So those of you who have taken epidemiology, you probably remember the distinction between descriptive and analytic epidemiology. We would see theory and the testing of theory within analytic epidemiology. We're trying to identify relationships, and often we're trying to identify causal relationships. And then the third criteria typical of a theory is that it should be applicable to a range of settings. A theory is not all that useful if it only applies in one very narrow context. For example, one very specific subpopulation or one very specific geographic region, and we don't see it applicable in other populations, regions, or settings. there isn't a hard and fast rule about when a theory is especially useful in terms of how many settings it can be applied and not useful. But keep in mind that theories are really intended to explain relationships in a range of settings. We're going to go through some examples of this. I know this is abstract at this point. Now, there's one very important component of a theory, or something that really needs to exist in order for a theory to be a good theory. And that is, we need our theory to be testable, meaning that we can, through empirical research, test whether or not a theory seems to hold weight, or whether or not it is true in a certain population. If a theory cannot be tested, then that means there's no way to disprove it, so it is not especially useful for us. Theories need to be testable. We need to be able to demonstrate whether or not this theory holds true. And related to this, theories in the social sciences, theories in public health are constantly evolving across time. Of course, we have some classic theories that we fall back on, and we're going to see a couple of those this week, but theories change across time, and that is how it should be. They should be built upon. Maybe with time, certain theories are refuted or revised in order to better fit a contemporary or current context. But theories are a fundamental part of social science and public health research, even though in public health we don't hear about theory quite as much as we do in other fields. Now let's apply that more general idea of a theory to health behavior. And it's important at this point for me to distinguish between health behavior theory and actual theories of health behavior, which might not make too much sense right now, but let me explain. So health behavior theory, it sounds like it is a specific testable theory. However, health behavior theory is actually a branch of public health research and literature. It is not a specific theory. And within health behavior theory, there are multiple actual testable theories. So health behavior theory as a field is concerned with explaining the determinants of health-related behaviors and also understanding approaches to change those maybe health-damaging behaviors. Now, there are multiple health behavior theories out there. I am not going to attempt to provide a complete list of those. And these theories are evolving across time and combining across time and being revised across time. But I'm going to provide you with just 3 very brief examples just to give you a sense of the kinds of health behavior theories that do exist. This is not a complete list. So the first one on here is the health belief model. And this is probably the most common health behavior theory out there. This is one that we see the most often in the research. And the health belief model, got to be careful with that B, it stands for belief, not behavior, theorizes how people's beliefs about their own risk for disease and their perceptions of the benefit of taking action to avoid that disease influences their readiness to actually take action in order to change behavior and prevent disease. And the health belief model has been mostly applied for prevention-based behaviors, such as screenings for cancer or hypertension management. And this is where beliefs are as important, or perhaps more important than the overt symptoms, okay? Because we're not symptomatic in screenings. So the health belief model, again, is one of the most common and is about people's perceptions of their own risk for disease. And then self-efficacy is also an important term here that we're going to see come back. And self-efficacy is about one's own sense of ability to avoid disease through their own choices. Okay, so self-efficacy is an important psychological construct, but here we can use it to understand health beliefs and then ultimately how one does actually behave. So that's one model. We're going to talk more about that one in the next few slides. There are 2 more examples here. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail because we could spend a lot of time on these. The second one here is the stages of change model. And This model is about individual readiness to adopt healthy behaviors. And it proposes that people are at different stages of readiness. For example, we could consider readiness to quit smoking among people who smoke. People are at different stages of readiness based on a number of factors. It could be based on how long they've been smoking. It could be based on whether this has become much more of a regular habit, as smoking does typically. It could be based on the existence of a known health risk, and that could motivate change, or observing somebody else experiencing health issues as a result of smoking. So there may be different stages of readiness based on, surrounding either context or the stage in which somebody is in their lives. Other examples, we could think about changes in physical activity or change in eating habits. People may be at different levels of readiness to change these behaviors. And this theory is especially useful when considering the effectiveness of counseling or health education programs, because readiness to change behavior is going to be a contributor to the overall success of these programs. And identifying readiness and individual differences in readiness to change may be an important component in evaluating these programs. Now, there is one more here, and that is social cognitive theory. This attempts to explain human behavior using a three-way interactive model, and the three components of this model are personal factors, characteristics of the individual, then also characteristics of the environment, so environmental influences, and then also one's own behaviors. And without getting into too much detail here, the social cognitive theory is an example of a theory within health behavior that's a little bit different, because it does have increased attention to environmental influences. And this is something that we are seeing more of in health behavior research, but theories do differ somewhat in the extent to which they bring in environmental and social contexts. That's all I'm going to say about social cognitive theory. I know it is a very incomplete definition. We are going to focus more on the health belief model from here to the end of the module, and also a bit in class. So let's take a closer look at the health belief model, and recall from the previous slide that the health belief model is about how people's beliefs about their own risk for disease, and also their perceptions of the benefits of taking certain actions to avoid getting a disease. How does this actually influence their action and their readiness to take action? Here you see a figure that's breaking it down a bit more, and there are some key terms within this figure that are important for understanding the health belief model. So we have modifying factors, individual beliefs, and then action. Those are the three major components of this model. The modifying factors are demographic characteristics, things like age, gender, ethnicity. I don't know why they have personality here, but according to the National Institutes of Health, personality we could also consider socioeconomic status and knowledge. So this is contextualized to an extent, but the primary focus still is on those individual beliefs. And you see several components here. One is, how susceptible does somebody think they are to a particular disease? And how severe do they think the disease is? So if we think about something like cardiovascular disease, we could consider how susceptible somebody thinks they are, maybe based on a family history or based on their own knowledge of the disease, and then how severe they think this disease is. And this is going to shape how a threat is or is not perceived for that particular disease. So that's one component of someone's individual beliefs that may shape the way that they act. There are other components here as well. So what are the perceived benefits of changing behavior? Is there great payoff if we think about cardiovascular disease? Is there great payoff to changing eating habits in order to actually decrease the risk of getting cardiovascular disease? And again, these are perceptions, so they might not necessarily be based in fact for individuals, but based on their own perceptions. What are perceived barriers? So if we're talking again about changing eating habits in order to prevent cardiovascular disease, Are there certain barriers that the person believes is there that are going to prevent them from making that behavioral change? And they could be, perceived is kind of a sticky word here. Perceived doesn't necessarily mean reality, but maybe in reality there are barriers to getting that healthy food. We live in a food desert, for example. Or maybe there are barriers that are perceived, but that actually are not necessarily as detrimental as the person perceives. For example, maybe somebody assumes that some medical treatment is not covered by their health insurance when in fact it is. That's just one example of a barrier that might be perceived but isn't actually present. And then the final component on this model for individual beliefs is perceived self-efficacy. And I mentioned that in the previous slide. And this is a component of the health belief model that's a bit more recent, so added more recently to this model. And self-efficacy is kind of connected to perceived barriers, but it's about an individual's perception of whether their actions are going to make a difference, essentially. Are they able to act in order to avoid an adverse health outcome? This is a widely used psychological construct used for a number of things. Here it's applied to the health belief model. At the far end of the slide, you see action as the third component of the model. And this is where we see individual behaviors. Do we see adoption of a new behavior, or do we see any kind of behavioral change, or do we not see any kind of behavioral change? There's also another kind of external factor here that comes into play, and that is cues to action. So for something like cardiovascular disease and changing eating habits, are there campaigns that are happening, like the Let's Move campaign? That was Michelle Obama's campaign in order to change activity. Hers was primarily focused on obesity, that campaign. But there may be other cues to action. If we think about smoking, anti-smoking or smoking cessation advertising, the urging of a loved one, spouse or a parent, a child, to change one's health behavior. That's another cue to action. So we see cues to action at all kinds of levels. And this also does affect the actual behaviors that somebody adopts. This, in a nutshell, is the health belief model. And we can operationalize this, and I hope that you saw that in one of your readings for this week, operationalizing the health belief model, meaning putting it practically into research and testing it. Now, there are a number of benefits to using a model like this, and there are also limitations or restrictions, and we'll talk about those in class. Now, one place where we're all thinking about health behaviors and behavioral change is in our own individual responses to the coronavirus pandemic, right? So do people adopt public health recommendations such as wearing a mask, washing hands, maintaining social distancing? These are all important interventions or important initiatives to try to slow the spread of the coronavirus. And we know in the US that we see a lot of variation in individuals' adoption of these health behaviors. A lot of variation. We see variation around the world, but we see a lot of variation in the US. So what I want you to do for this video question is to apply the health belief model to individuals' responses or lack of response in terms of individual behavior to the coronavirus pandemic. I have a rather frustrating video for you to watch called Why Alabama Beachgoers Aren't Worried About COVID-19. And this was filmed back in May, I believe it was Memorial Day weekend. Someone walking around on the beach interviewing some beachgoers about why they're at the beach, why they're sitting all close to each other, not wearing masks and so on. And you hear people's responses. And what I want you to do is reflect on how the responses of the people being interviewed in the video relate to the health belief model. Then there's a second part to this question. Overall, do you think the health belief model adequately explains people's decisions to engage in or to not engage in health behaviors to prevent contracting or spreading COVID-19? So, in other words, do you think that this model does a good job of explaining why we see the behaviors that we do in, for example, individuals in Alabama on the beach? Once you answer that, I want you to explain why you either think the health belief model is doing a good job here in explaining what we see, or maybe there are some limitations or omissions within this model. I'm asking you to evaluate the strengths or limitations of this model, and we will talk more about this in class, all right? So at this point, you can pause, watch that video clip on Inquire, and then answer the video question and return back here after you're done. The last part that I want to discuss here before wrapping up the module is the health belief model as applied to HPV vaccination. And this was the topic for your third reading for this week. To give you a bit of background on HPV, HPV is a highly preventable STI through vaccination, and this vaccine has really only been on the market for probably the past 20 years or so. I remember when it was a brand new vaccine around the time I was an adolescent. HPV is also a leading cause of cervical cancer in women, so preventing HPV is very important. However, adoption of the HPV vaccination, which should happen in adolescents, is lower than it could be globally and in the US. So this is a very small table, I know. It's quite possible you can't read this at all on the YouTube video, but I did put in a red box the statistics for HPV vaccination among all adolescents, among females, and among males. UTD stands for up to date, and then because there's actually 3 doses of the vaccine. Maybe they've changed it to 2 since I had it, but it was 3 when I had it. And then there also are those who have had at least 1 dose of the vaccine. So this would include those who are up to date, but also include those who haven't quite completed the sequence for getting the full vaccination. And what you see among all adolescents is also showing us across time, and also by age. In 2017, among all adolescents, the up-to-date vaccination percentage was 48.6%, so less than half. And by 2018, it was up by a couple percentage points at 51.1%. And this is among males and females. About half of adolescents up to date on their vaccinations for HPV. That's pretty low. We do see that females have a higher vaccination rate, which makes sense for a couple of reasons. One, the vaccine was not available for males up until several years after it was available for females. So it was widely advertised and promoted among female adolescents and was not available at all for males for some number of years. The other part, or the other reason why this may make sense to us, is because cervical cancer uniquely affects females, right? So the vaccination rate may be higher among females if we're just thinking from an individualistic standpoint, is going to benefit those females directly, and not necessarily the case for males, though there is some evidence that there are other cancers that may be caused by HPV in males, but we're not going to go down that road right now. But we do see that for females in 2018, the vaccination rate was 53.7%, and for males it was 48.7%. So the gap is closing, but there is a slight difference there still. So the question becomes, how do we explain why HPV vaccination is low relative to other vaccinations? And there are other vaccinations on this table. This is coming from the CDC. Why do we see a difference when it comes to HPV vaccination? And what is the role of parents? Preferences, beliefs, perceptions of risk of the vaccination or the benefits of vaccination and so on, because parents are often the ones who are making these decisions, not the adolescents. So that's where the article that you read for this week comes in. Finally, here is your content question for this week. I want you to briefly summarize findings from the Writer et al. Article. How do you think these findings could translate to public health interventions to increase HPV vaccination rates? So at this point, you can pause the PowerPoint module, answer this content question on Inquire, and then return for the final slide. Okay, that concludes our PowerPoint module for this week. As usual, we're going to have our in-class group meeting on Wednesday in class and our Zoom group meeting on Friday on Zoom. Please do come prepared to discuss the topic for this week. Okay, I will see you in class or on Zoom.